The rain should have left nothing more than mud in Eli Mercer's backfield. Yet when his old tractor sank, the earth gave up a secret no one expected. Neighbors came running, shovels in hand, and what they uncovered silenced even the sheriff. A rusted shell, sealed shut, marked with a faded military emblem. By dawn, federal trucks had taken everything, leaving Eli with nothing but scars in his soil and questions no one dared answer. What was hidden beneath his farm all those years, and why was it removed under such heavy guard? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The storm had rolled through the night before, a steady downpour that rattled windows and drummed against the tin roof of Eli Mercer's farmhouse. By dawn, the sky had cleared, leaving behind a heavy gray stillness that seemed to press down on the land itself. The field stretched wide and low, dark with waterlogged soil that glistened under the weak morning sun. Puddles gathered in shallow ruts where the tractor had run before, and the grass along the fence line hung heavy with droplets. Eli rose early, as he always did, his body carrying the rhythm of decades spent working the same acres. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards damp beneath his boots, and drew in a breath of air that smelled of earth, rain, and the faint sweetness of wet hay. Out back, the fields waited, half drowned, but needing tending all the same. He tugged his cap lower, pulled on his gloves, and walked toward the shed where his old John Deere sat waiting like a trusted companion. The machine had been with him through drought and flood, planting and harvest. Its green paint had long faded, the edges rusting, but it ran true when nothing else seemed steady. Eli eased himself into the worn seat, turned the key, and listened as the engine coughed before settling into a low rumble. He guided it out onto the field, the tires cutting to the soft ground with little resistance at first. He'd learned over the years to read the soil like a man reads weather, but sometimes even experience misjudged what lay beneath the surface. The backfield had always been tricky, a low patch near the woods where water gathered. He should have waited a day or two, but patience was a luxury when the season pressed forward. The tractor rolled across the first stretch without trouble, the ground spongy, but holding. Eli kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the throttle, his eyes scanning the earth ahead. A crow flapped lazily from a fence post, wings black against the pale sky, and for a moment everything felt routine. Then the rear tires lurched, sinking fast into the wet clay with a sucking sound that snapped his attention sharp. The machine groaned, tilted slightly, and the familiar hum turned into a strained growl. Eli cursed under his breath and tried easing the throttle, hoping to rock the tractor forward. The wheels spun, flinging arcs of mud into the air, but the machine only sank deeper. He shifted gears, leaned his weight forward as though it might help, but the back end dropped lower with each attempt. The smell of churned earth rose thick, mingling with the oily tang of the tractor's exhaust. Birds startled from the hedgerow at the sudden noise, scattering across the gray morning sky. He killed the engine and sat still for a moment, staring at the stubborn patch of earth that had swallowed his machine. His calloused hands rested on the wheel, the veins raised and pale from years of work. Out in the distance, the land stretched silent, as if watching him wrestle with the weight of something that refused to let go. Eli sighed, pulled off his cap to wipe the sweat already gathering his brow, and slid down from the seat into the muck. His boots sank with a squelch, water seeping in through seams that had given up seasons ago. He circled the tractor slowly, eyeing the way the mud clung to the tires like hungry hands. This wasn't just soft ground. It was a grip, tight and deliberate, the kind of soil that had swallowed wagons in his grandfather's time. He pressed his palm against the hood, feeling the warmth of the engine fading into the cool air. He could almost hear the land whispering its refusal. For the first time that morning, he felt a weight heavier than the machine itself, something that pressed in from beneath the field. Alone in the wide silence, Eli Mercer stood ankle-deep in mud beside the tractor he had trusted all his life, unaware that the earth had more to give than resistance. What waited beneath was not simply wet soil or a farmer's inconvenience. It was something older, hidden, waiting for this moment of chance, when rain and weight combined to pull it just close enough to the surface to be seen. Eli climbed back onto the seat, mud clinging to his boots and smearing the worn metal steps. He turned the key again, and the tractor roared to life with a cough of smoke. The vibration rattled through his body as he eased it into gear, rocking it forward, then back, trying to coax the wheels free. Each attempt only deepened the ruts. The rear tires spun wildly, throwing up clumps of wet earth that landed across the hood and splattered his overalls. He muttered curses under his breath, shifting his weight as though his own body could lend strength to the fight. The machine groaned, protesting with every motion. Eli leaned forward, gripping the wheel tightly, his shoulders hunched and tense. He knew the ground in this backfield better than most men knew the faces of their kin, yet the rain had turned it into something else, an enemy that swallowed whole whatever tried to cross. He pressed the throttle, feeling the tractor lurch, but it dropped again, sinking deeper until the axles kissed the mud. The smell of hot metal and wet clay filled the air. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning. He killed the engine and slid down once more, boots making that sucking sound as he pulled them free with each step. He walked around the tractor, studying angles, testing with his boot how soft the ground was beyond the ruts. Every time he tried to wedge something under the tires, broken boards, a few old fence posts left stacked near the hedgerow, the mud seemed to swallow those too. It was like feeding wood into a furnace, each effort vanishing without reward. A pickup slowed on the road beyond the fence. The driver, an older man in a bald cap, leaned out the window, calling across the ditch, "You need a hand, Eli?" Eli waved him off with a forced half-smile. "I'll manage." His voice carried, but it was thinner than his confidence. The pickup rolled on, though not without the driver casting another long look at the stranded tractor. By noon, that glance would turn into a story at the diner, and by evening the whole town would know. Eli tried again, climbing back into the seat, rocking the tractor with short bursts of throttle. The front end lifted slightly, slamming back down with a jolt that rattled his bones. Mud sprayed high, landing in his hair, streaking his face. His hands, slick with sweat and dirt, slipped on the wheel. He could hear the sound of the engine laboring, straining against the impossible, until at last he shut it down again, chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Another car slowed, then another, this time a pair of teenagers on their way into town, leaned out the window with curious grins. One raised his phone, snapping a picture before Eli shouted at them to keep moving. Their laughter trailed down the road like a string of tin cans tied to a bumper. The sight of his tractor, sunk deep in mud, which spread faster than he could dig himself free. Eli stood in the ruts, staring at the machine as if sheer will could lift it. His shoulders sagged, the weight of years pressing against him as firmly as the ground gripped the tires. He dug at the muck with a shovel, sweat dripping onto the handle, but each spadeful filled in as quickly as he removed it. It was a losing battle, one he could not admit defeat in. Not yet. Overhead, the sky had brightened, but the field remained dim, the mud reflecting every glint of light like a mirror of defeat. Eli knew he'd have to call for help soon, but pride held his tongue. For now, it was just him against the earth, a silent struggle witnessed by crows circling above and the occasional neighbor passing slow along the road, each glance a reminder that his private fight was no longer his alone. The field itself seemed to hold him, not only the tractor, as though the land had claimed both man and machine in a grip that would not loosen. By the time the sun had climbed higher, the tractor sat like a wounded beast in the middle of the field, half buried, its once proud stance reduced to a sagging weight in the mud. Eli leaned against a fender, cap pulled low, staring at it as if the machine might free itself if only he waited long enough. His arms ached from his shoveling, and his boots carried an extra weight of mud that clung stubbornly, making every step feel like he was dragging the field itself along with him. Pride kept him fighting alone all morning, but now the reality pressed hard. This was a job bigger than one man. He reached into the cab, pulled out his worn flip phone, and punched in his son's number. Caleb answered on the second ring, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Pa, you all right?" Eli's words came low and steady. "Need you down at the backfield. Tractor stuck. Bring the chain and call Jonas. Tell him to meet us with his John Deere. We'll need the pull." There was no room for argument in his tone, though the pause on the line suggested Caleb understood the weight of it. "I'll be there in 10, his son said, already moving. Eli slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned his gaze to the road that bordered the field. Another pickup slowed, two women inside craning their necks to get a look. They didn't stop, but their eyes told the story. This was becoming a spectacle. Word in the town like theirs didn't travel by chance. It galloped. Minutes later, Caleb's truck rattled up the lane, dust still damp from the rain rising behind it. He was tall like his father, but leaner, the kind of strength that came from long days of labor without complaint. He hopped out, chain slung over his shoulder, boots sinking instantly into the mire. "Pa, you buried it good," he said, trying for humor, but his eyes betrayed concern. Jonas arrived soon after, the familiar growl of his tractor carrying across the fields. He was a neighbor in the truest sense, a man who knew when to lend a hand without being asked twice. He pulled up alongside the fence, climbed down with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who'd seen more years than he cared to count. His beard was grayer now, but his eyes still sharp. "Looks like she's been swallowed whole," Jonas muttered, surveying the scene. "Gonna take more than muscle to drag her out." Together, the three men worked to loop the heavy chain around the axle, their movements slow in the thick mud. The links clanged, echoing across the quiet field as Caleb and Jonas guided it into place. Eli grunted, pulling tight, the metal cold and slick in his hands. They attached the other end to Jonas's tractor, its tires already biting into firmer ground near the fence line. By now, the first curious neighbors had gathered at the edge of the field. A cluster of figures leaned on the wooden posts, arms crossed, watching silently. Their boots stayed on dry ground, but their eyes followed every motion. Some had come out of concern, others from curiosity, and a few because in a town like Anvil Creek, the sight of a farmer's struggle was as sure to draw a crowd as a fire siren. Eli could feel their stares pressing on him. His jaw tightened, his pride a stubborn thing that resisted being put on display. He climbed back onto the tractor's seat, signaling with a hand. Caleb took position by the chain, Jonas in the cab of his John Deere, ready to pull. Engines roared in unison, smoke puffing into the cool air. The ground trembled under force. The mud resisted, groaning like something alive. The old tractor shuddered, wheels spinning in place, chains straining so tight they sang under the weight. The sound carried across the field, mingling with the murmurs of the gathered crowd. Eli's knuckles whitened on the wheel. He would not give up, not with half the town watching. What had begun as a simple mishap was turning into a trial, the kind men remembered and retold at the diner for years after. And as the struggle played out, none of them yet realized that the mud held more than a tractor. Something else was being pulled toward the light, something hidden beneath the field for longer than any of them had been alive. Jonas settled himself behind the wheel of his John Deere, the engine rumbling low before he eased the throttle forward. Caleb stood to the side, one hand raised, watching the tension ripple through the chain as it grew taut. Eli gripped the wheel of his own sunken tractor, body braced like a man holding on to a lifeline. Around them, the quiet murmur of the gathered neighbors hushed, leaving only the growl of machines and the restless cawing of crows overhead. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and diesel, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The first pull came hard and sudden. Jonas's tractor dug in, tires spinning for grip, spitting mud as it lurched forward. Eli's machine groaned but held fast, the chain singing under strain. The sound was sharp, metallic, slicing through the field silence. Caleb shouted for Jonas to ease back, then signaled for another attempt. Engines idled, smoke drifting upward in lazy spirals, before command was given to pull again. This time the force was steady, a relentless tug that made every link in the chain quiver. Eli pressed his foot to the throttle, wheels thrashing uselessly, flinging arcs of mud across his own arms and face. The tractor shuddered, groaned, then shifted an inch, then two. The ground sucked at it, unwilling to release what it had claimed. The crowd along the fence leaned forward as one, eyes fixed, breaths caught. Jonas barked something over the roar, unheard but understood. He pressed harder, his machine straining with a deep, guttural roar. Eli's tractor jerked suddenly, rising an inch higher. Mud sloshed and bubbled around the tires, the earth groaning as though something beneath had been disturbed. Caleb shouted encouragement, fists clenched, while neighbors muttered under their breath. Prayers, wagers, disbelief. Then it happened. With a sound like a cork pulled from a bottle, the old tractor tore free, lurching forward violently enough to throw Eli against the steering wheel. The chain snapped slack, clattering to the ground. For a moment, the victory was clear. Cheers erupted from the fence line. Caleb grinned with relief. Jonas eased his throttle back and patted his dashboard as if congratulating an old friend. But the noise of triumph faltered when eyes turned to the place where the tractor had been buried. The mud didn't simply collapse back into a rut. It heaved upward, bulging, as though something had been lying beneath the surface, trapped and waiting. A mound of darkness rose slowly, glistening wet, its edges catching light in a way no stone or root ever could. The soil clung stubbornly to it, sliding down its sides in thick rivulets, revealing the suggestion of shape. Eli climbed down from his tractor, boots squelching as he stepped closer. The crowd at the fence grew louder, questions rising, though none dared cross into the field. The mound stood taller now, black metal peeking through patches of slick earth, not rusty like farm scrap, but dark and smooth, the kind of surface that had no place buried in a farmer's field. Jonas killed his engine, silence rushing back heavy and unsettled. Even the crows had gone quiet, wheeling above without a sound. Eli's hand hovered just above the strange surface, fingers trembling but not yet touching. He had thought the mud was fighting him for the tractor. Now he wasn't so sure. Whatever had been waiting beneath had stirred, brought into daylight by the stubborn heave of chains and engines. The neighbors pressed closer to the fence, voices hushed, as if afraid to break whatever fragile stillness had settled over the field. The tractor was free, but in its place something else had been freed as well. And no one watching could shake the feeling that they had unearthed something that was never meant to be found. The mound held steady in the center of the field, slick with mud that slid down its sides in thick ribbons. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The tractor's engine ticked as it cooled, a hollow metallic sound that seemed too small against the weight of what lay revealed. Eli stood with his boots half sunken in the ruts, his hands resting just above his knees, bent forward as if his body refused to stand tall in the presence of whatever was surfacing. The neighbors at the fence shifted uneasily, leaning in without daring to cross the line of posts and barbed wire. Caleb was the first to step closer, wiping the mud from his brow with the back of his arm. His young face was pale beneath the streaks of dirt, but curiosity drew him on. "Pa!" he whispered, pointing. The glint caught the weak sun again, unmistakably metallic, not stone, not farm scrap, either. It curved, deliberate, as though shaped by hands and machines, not by nature. Eli's throat tightened. He reached down, scooping a handful of wet earth, and tossed aside. The mound gave way to a corner, sharp, angular, painted once perhaps, but now dulled by time and burial. He rubbed it with a rag from his pocket, smearing away the layers of mud. A dark sheen came through, cold and unnatural against the warm tones of the soil. It was no plow, no piece of equipment lost to a careless farmer decades ago. It was something larger, hidden on purpose. Jonas joined them, his boots heavy, his face set with the kind of wary recognition a man carried from years of working the land. He crouched, dragging his fingers across the exposed edge. "That ain't rock," he said flatly. "And it ain't farm metal either. That's been built." His words fell into the silence like stones into water, rippling outward, pulling more of the neighbors closer to the fence. Murmurs began to rise. A woman clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, whispering to the man beside her. Two teenagers, braver or more foolish than the rest, climbed up on the fence for a better look. One raised his phone, snapping pictures until Eli's sharp glare froze in mid-frame. This was no moment for snapshots. This was something different. The soil around the mound continued to sag, slipping away from its sides. More edges emerged, panels, rivets, a seam running in a straight line across its surface. Eli traced it with his eyes, unease prickling the back of his neck. It wasn't just buried, it was sealed. The kind of seal made to last, to keep whatever was inside from ever getting out, or from being found. Jonas straightened, brushing mud from his palms, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't dropped here. Someone put it here, meant for it to stay hidden. His voice carried, and the weight of the idea settled on every ear. Deliberate, buried deep, where plows wouldn't find it, where farmers would pass by for generations without knowing. Eli stepped back, his breath heavy in his chest. The tractor was forgotten now, its muddy tires still dripping into the ruts. The field had yielded up something far older, far stranger. He turned toward the crowd at the fence, saw their faces, fear, awe, suspicion, all reflected back at him. He felt their eyes asking questions he had no answers for. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of churned soil, sharp metallic, like blood on iron. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, sharp and quick, then fell silent. The mound stood unmoving, dark against the pale sky, its angles growing clearer with each slide of earth. Caleb crouched again, resting a cautious hand near the surface without touching. "Pa!" he said softly. This don't belong here." His words trailed into the stillness, and everyone knew he was right. What had risen from beneath the mud was no accident history, no relic left behind by chance. It was a secret, carefully buried in the quiet earth of farmer's field. And the rain had conspired with an old tractor to pull it back into the light. The field was no longer just a place of work. It had become a stage, and the mound at its center the only actor anyone cared to watch. The first moments had been tense, hesitant. Neighbors shifting their weight at the fence line, murmuring low. But curiosity, once sparked, grew quickly. By late afternoon, men had returned with shovels slung over their shoulders, some borrowed from barns. Others pulled hastily from the beds of trucks. They didn't ask permission. They simply crossed a fence and trudged into the mud, boots sinking deep with every step, eyes fixed on a metallic shape that glistened under its coat of soil. Women followed with lanterns, glass globes smudged from storage but still burning clean once lit. They were carried high, the flickering light fighting the creeping dusk. Their glow cast long shadows across the churned field, stretching across faces drawn with suspicion and wonder. Children clung to fence rails, knuckles white, eyes wide, their voices hushed as though instinct told them not to laugh or shout in the presence of whatever had been found. Eli said nothing. He stood close, mud streaking his overalls, the brim of his cap low enough to hide the questions in his eyes. This was his field, his tractor that had pulled the secret loose, yet he no longer felt ownership. The land itself seemed to have claimed authority, drawing people in as if it wanted witnesses. The first shovelfuls fell heavy, the sound of metal biting earth echoing against the quiet. One man grunted, leaning into the motion, his blade striking the exposed surface with a hollow clang that silenced everyone for a breath. He glanced at Eli, then back at the mound, and without speaking, kept digging. Soon the rhythm took hold. Dig, toss, scrape, reveal. Layer by layer, the soil slid away. The lanterns revealed corners and edges, lines too precise for natural formation. Rivets appeared, neat rows catching the light. A panel emerged, then another, fitting together with a precision that mocked the rough ground it had been buried in. The surface was not the pitted iron of farm scrap. It was smoother, darker, the kind of metal that resisted time and weather. Mud streaked across it like paint, but wherever it was wiped away, it shone faintly as if refusing to rust. Caleb worked with the others, his young arms straining at the shovel, sweat cutting paths through the dirt on his face. Every strike seemed to carry urgency, as though the shape demanded to be revealed before the night closed in. He caught his father's gaze once, and Eli only nodded, a silent agreement that words could not hold. The children whispered guesses to each other. An old tank, a buried train car, treasure left by outlaws. Their mothers hushed them, though the words carried truth in their own nervous tone. No one knew what this was. No one could explain why it was here. Jonas leaned on his shovel, breathing heavy, eyes narrowed as more of the object came clear. "This ain't scrap," he muttered. "This was put here with purpose. Someone meant for it to stay hidden." His voice carried across the circle of diggers, and though no one answered, everyone knew he was right. Mud gave way to shape, a curve that suggested a hull, a seam that ran straight as a drawn line, a corner too sharp for accident. It stretched wider than a wagon, longer than a plow. The deeper they dug, the stranger it seemed, not just because of its size, but because of the way it sat, angled, deliberate, like a thing set carefully into the earth and then forgotten. As lantern light wavered, catching on the slick metal, silence hung heavier than the dusk. The sound of shovels slowed, men pausing to study what their hands had revealed. The crowd at the fence leaned closer, breaths fogging in the cooling air. Children stood on tiptoe, clutching at sleeves. Women whispered each other's names, their voices trembling with unease. By the time darkness settled, the mound was no longer just a mound. It was a thing with edges and seams, a buried secret that had taken form under the labor of many hands. And though no one dared say it aloud, every face showed the same thought. Whatever this was, it had been meant to remain unseen. Yet now it was here, and the earth had given up its silence. The shovels slowed, their rhythm breaking as more of the buried shape emerged. Lantern light trembled across the exposed surface, revealing a sweep of metal broad and curved, streaked with brown where time had finally left its mark. Mud still clung in thick patches, but enough had been clear that its identity began to take form. It was no plow blade, no piece of machinery from the farm's past. The edges were too deliberate, the construction too heavy, too armored. It sat there in the earth like a relic of war, dragged halfway back into daylight by accident and stubborn persistence. The diggers stepped back, their boots sinking in the churned ground. Jonas wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, squinting at what lay before them. "That's no scrap heap," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice carried anyway, and the people gathered at the fence drew closer, straining to see. A murmur spread through them, low and uneasy, the kind of sound that rolls across a crowd when something doesn't fit the world as they know it. Eli crouched near the edge, resting his weight on one knee, his hand hovering just above the metal without touching. The lantern glow showed rivets along the side, each one stubborn against rust, each one placed with precision. He thought of his father's stories. Machines left in fields after the war, tanks rusting under weeds, old convoys abandoned to time. But nothing in those tales had hinted at something buried whole beneath farmland. He leaned closer, brushing away clumps of mud with a rag from his pocket, until the curve of a hatch revealed itself. It seemed faint but undeniable. His stomach nodded at the sight. The neighbors began to talk in hurried whispers. A woman wrapped her shawl tighter and asked if it was dangerous, if it might be a bomb left from some long-forgotten training ground. One of the men at the fence argued it was a buried tank, maybe sold for scrap and hidden away. Others shook their heads. Whatever it was, it had been sealed, not discarded. The difference sat heavy in the cool night air. Caleb pressed closer, his young face pale in the glow. "It looks like a vehicle," he said softly, as though speaking too loud might rouse it. He reached out, brushing mud from the edge of what looked like a viewport. Beneath the grime, the faint outline of glass remained, shattered and dark, a hollow eye staring back at him from another time. He pulled his hand back quickly, heart pounding. Jonas spat into the mud, his eyes still fixed on the shape. "Armored," he said firmly. "Look at the thickness. Whatever it is, it wasn't meant to travel these fields. This is something from somewhere else." His words silenced the murmurs for a moment, leaving only the hiss of lanterns and the occasional groan of metal settling in the cool night air. The crowd grew restless, shuffling at the fence line. Children clung to their parents, eyes wide with both fear and fascination. The men with shovels stood in a loose half-circle, studying the revealed shell as though it might move on its own. Eli rose slowly, his breath heavy, his face unreadable. He had not asked for this, yet here it was, pulled from the depths of his land, demanding recognition. A rusted shell, armored and heavy, lay before them, carrying the weight of a story no one yet understood. The earth had hidden it well, but now it was awake again under the lantern light, a shadow of another age intruding on their own. And though no one said the words, everyone standing there felt the same cold truth settle deep in their bones. Something long buried had returned, and it was not done speaking. The sound of tires crunching over gravel drew every head toward the lane. Headlights swept across the field, bouncing against the fence posts and catching the uneasy faces of crowd. A county cruiser rolled to a stop, its red and blue light spinning, but siren quiet. The door opened with a metallic creak, and Sheriff Dalton stepped out, his broad shoulders framed against the glow of the headlights. He wore his uniform jacket buttoned tight against the night air, one hand resting on the brim of his hat as he took in the scene before him. The murmurs at the fence hushed. Even the shovels fell still for a moment, their blades pressed into the earth as if waiting for permission to rise again. Dalton's boots sank slightly in the mud as he made his way toward the crowd, his flashlight beam cutting across the exposed shell at the center of the field. He stopped just short of the fence, his jaw set hard, his eyes narrowing as the beam traced rivets, seams, and the curve of a hatch glistening under lantern light. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice carrying with practiced authority. Everybody stepped back. This is county business now. No one moved. The men holding shovels looked at one another, mud streaking their clothes, breath fogging in the cold air. Women shifted their lanterns nervously, their flames quivering. Children clung tighter to the fence rails. Eli stood still, arms crossed, cap pulled low, his silence louder than any protest. Dalton's eyes lingered on him. "Eli," he said more softly, "this is your land, but you know as well as I do that what you've dug up isn't just some scrap heap. Step back before someone gets hurt." Eli met his gaze, the lines of his face etched deep by years in the field. "And if we stop, Sheriff, who's going to explain what it is? Who's going to tell this town why it's been under our feet all this time?" His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that settled uneasily on those listening. Dalton shifted, uneasy. He lifted the radio on his shoulder, muttering into it, calling for backup, for state officials, for anyone who might know what to make of the thing in the mud. When he lowered it again, his eyes swept over the crowd. He cleared his throat. "Until the state gets here, no one touches it. No more digging. You hear me?" But even as the words left his mouth, a man drove his shovel into the earth with a dull thud, followed by another and another. The rhythm picked up again, as though the order had been nothing more than wind passing over the field. Dalton barked. I said stop, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. Curiosity had its hold, and once it rooted in a crowd, it was stronger than law. Dalton walked closer, mud pulling at his boots, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. He leaned down, eyes scanning the riveted surface, and for a flicker of a moment his composure cracked. His lips pressed in, his brow furrowed, and he took one half-step back as though the thing itself unsettled him more than the crowd defying his command. A neighbor whispered to another, "He don't like it either. Look at him." The word spread quick, passed from mouth to mouth, until the whole fence line seemed to hum with the idea. Dalton straightened, lifting his chin, forcing the mass of authority back onto his face. But his eyes betrayed him. They lingered too long on the hatch, too long on the black metal that had no rust where there should have been, too long on the way the ground seemed reluctant to give it up fully. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, then closed it, the words swallowed by the night. The crowd had seen enough to know. Their sheriff, the man who had stood steady through storms, fires, and feuds, looked uneasy, and that unease weighed heavier than any order he gave. The digging continued, slow and deliberate. As Dalton stood helpless at the edge of the lantern light, a lawman bound not by his badge but by the same gnawing curiosity that held them all. The lanterns threw a weak circle of light across the object as more mud was scraped away, shovels and hands working side by side now. The metal surface stretched wider with every inch uncovered, its cold, dark body defying the years it had lain beneath the soil. The crowd pressed closer, breaths foggy in the cool night, eyes fixed on the strange shape that no one could yet name. It was Caleb who first paused, his hand resting on the edge of the hull, his brow furrowed. "There's something here," he murmured, voice low but urgent. He brushed at the spot with the sleeve of his shirt, then spit into his palm and rubbed harder, smearing away the grime. Slowly, a shape emerged, curved lines, faded but deliberate, painted once in colors long surrendered to the earth. He stepped back, his breath catching in his chest. "Pa!" he whispered, motioning Eli forward. Eli crouched, his callous hand tracing the faint design. At first it looked like nothing more than scratches, but as more of the mud came off, the outline sharpened. A circle, crossed with wings, and within it, the suggestion of a star. Though dulled and ghost-like, it was unmistakable. An emblem, military in origin, stamped with authority not of farms or factories, but of governments and war. The men nearest leaned in, their shovels forgotten. Jonas bent close, his old eyes narrowing as he recognized it. His lips pressed tight, and he shook his head slowly. "That's Army," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Or was once. His words fell heavy, rolling through the silence like a warning bell. Across the fence, among the gathered crowd, a few older men stepped closer. Their movements were stiff, deliberate, their faces shadowed with memories they rarely spoke of. One wore his veteran's cap. The stitching faded from sun and time. He stared at the emblem, and his mouth tightened as though he were saluting silently, against his will. Another folded his arms, shoulders rigid, his eyes clouded not with curiosity but with recognition. They knew the symbol. They knew what it meant. The chatter that had filled the evening faltered, replaced by a tense quiet that hung heavier than the night itself. Women pulled their children closer, sensing the shift without needing the history behind it. The younger men glanced from face to face, waiting for someone to explain. But no explanation came, only the uneasy silence of those who understood too well. Sheriff Dalton, standing near the edge of the lantern light, stepped forward at last. His flashlight beam cut across the emblem, making it stand out stark against the dark surface. His jaw worked, but for a moment no words came. Finally, he said, "This isn't ours to touch anymore. That mark, it belongs to something bigger than this county." But even as he said it, his voice carried doubt, and his hand trembled slightly as he lowered the light. Jonas broke the stillness with a voice rough as gravel. "That thing's no relic from a farm. Someone put it here, and they didn't mean for us to find it." He spat into the mud, as if to mark the ground with his own defiance. The veterans said nothing. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke louder than any words, a silence born of memory and respect, tinge of fear that reached back through the years. The emblem had woken something in them, something they thought buried as deep as the machine itself. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers breaking through again, this time sharper, filled with speculation. Treasure, a weapon, a ghost from a war that had never touched their quiet town. But beneath the noise lingered a truth they could not ignore. The object in the mud bore a mark of power, of conflict, of secrets long sealed away. And as the lanterns flickered in the night wind, the emblem stared back at them like an eye half closed, daring them to keep digging, daring them to see what else had been left beneath the soil. By the time the lanterns in the field were snuffed out and the last shovel had been leaned against the fence, the story had already begun to travel. Pickup trucks rumbled back down the dirt roads, their headlights cutting the fog that settled low across the town. Men drove home with mud still caked on their boots. Women with shawls wrapped tight carried whispers, as if they were bundles to be delivered. By the time the clock at the courthouse struck 9, the diner on Main Street was alive with talk, the scent of coffee and fried onions mingling with rumor until no one could tell which was stronger. The counter stools were filled, boots tapping against the foot rails, hands wrapped around mugs that had been refilled 4 times. Farmers, mill workers, shopkeepers, all had drifted in, drawn not by hunger but by the need to hear and to tell. The waitress moved between tables with her pad in hand, though no one was ordering much. Every ear was bent toward the same subject, the thing in Eli Mercer's field. Some spoke with certainty, as if their guesses were fact. One man claimed it was a tank, left behind from training exercises during the war. Government must have buried it when they didn't want to haul it back, he said, stabbing the counter with a finger. His voice carried, and heads nodded, though not all with agreement. Others leaned in closer, voices hushed, weaving stories darker still. Not a tank, one whispered, a transport. Carried something they didn't want found. You don't hide a machine like that unless you're hiding what's inside it. His words sent a ripple through the group, faces tightening, imaginations quickening. At the back booth, a pair of veterans sat in silence, their coffee untouched. They had been at the field, had seen the emblem with their own eyes, and their silence now spoke volumes. When pressed, one simply shook his head. "Doesn't matter what we think," he muttered. "Whatever it is, it's not meant for us." That answer only fueled the fire, leaving space for wilder ideas to take root. Treasure was the word on many tongues before long. Someone claimed their grandfather had heard stories of convoys gone missing in the 40s, shipments that never reached their destination. Gold, he said with a half smile, or maybe bonds. They said crates went missing, and the government never admitted it. Maybe they're under that hatch right now. His words made the younger men's eyes gleam, and the older ones chuckle without conviction. But not every theory came with gold at the end. A woman near the window leaned across her table, her voice trembling as she spoke. What if it's worse? Chemicals, weapons, something dangerous they buried so it'd never be used. She clutched her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked glass as though expecting to see lights rolling back into town. The cook leaned out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag, adding his own certainty to the mix. If it was just scrap, the sheriff would have laughed it off. But you saw him. He looked spooked. I never seen Dalton back away from anything. The diner hummed with agreement. The sheriff's unease remembered and retold until it became larger than life. By 10 o'clock, the walls of the diner seemed to hold more speculation than sound. Government secrets, buried war machines, missing shipments that vanished into small-town soil. Each telling grew taller, each whisper darker, until the line between truth and imagination blurred beyond recognition. And yet, through it all, the same question lingered, unspoken but heavy. If the ground could hide something like that for so long, what else might be buried beneath their feet, waiting for rain and chance to bring it back to light? By morning, the field no longer belonged to Eli Mercer. Dawn had barely brushed the tops of the trees when the first government trucks arrived, their engines low and purposeful, tires cutting grooves into the softened dirt of the lane. The neighbors who had gathered early, some curious, others simply unwilling to let go of what they'd witnessed the night before, watched in silence as men in dark jackets stepped out. They moved without wasted motion, unloading gear, unspooling rolls of bright yellow tape, driving posts into ground with swift, practiced strikes. Within minutes, the familiar stretch of farmland was transformed into something foreign, sealed off as though it were no longer soil but evidence. Eli stood near the fence, his cap pulled low, the brim shadowing his eyes. He had risen early as always, and walked out the back field with a stubborn hope that it might all look different in the morning light. But the mound of metal still loomed where the tractor had sunk, only now it was surrounded by strangers who walked with authority, radios crackling at their belts. One of them, a man with a clipboard and a hard jaw, approached Eli directly. His tone was clipped, official. "Sir, I need you to step back. This area is under investigation." Eli lifted his chin. "This is my land," he said simply, voice steady but low. "My father plowed it before me. My son will after me. You don't tell me to step back from it." The man's expression didn't soften. "Sir, we have jurisdiction now. Whatever's under there, it's federal. For your safety, you'll need to remain outside the perimeter." He gestured toward the tape, being strung across the posts. Behind him, more men in dark windbreakers crouched near the object, taking photographs, running gloved hands across the exposed insignia. Jonas appeared at Eli's side, mud still dried along the cuffs of his pants from the night before. He said nothing, only folded his arms across his chest, his silence a quiet protest. Caleb came too, his young face burning with frustration, fists clenched at his sides. He looked ready to speak, but Eli's hand on his shoulder kept him still. The officials worked quickly. Portable floodlights were hauled from trucks and positioned along the field, though the sun was already climbing. Generators coughed to life, their steady hum mixing with the voices of men speaking in terms no one else understood. The yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, a line that separated the people from the very ground they had walked on their whole lives. Neighbors arrived in clusters, drawn by the commotion. They lined up at the edge of the tape, whispers spreading, faces tight with a mix of awe and resentment. Some craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside the cordoned-off space. Others shook their heads, muttering about rights and government secrets, their voices bitter with the knowledge that something had been taken from their town. Sheriff Dalton stood among them, no longer in command, his hat pulled low as he watched men in suits take control of what it failed to contain. His presence carried little weight now, reduced to just another bystander. When Eli caught his eye, Dalton looked away, the lines of his face harder than ever. The digging that felt like a communal act of discovery the night before was gone. In its place was procedure, urgency, and silence enforced by strangers. Clipboards filled with notes. Photographs captured every angle. Samples of soil were bagged and labeled. The object was no longer a mystery shared. It was a case file. Eli pressed his palms against the top rail of the fence, the wood rough beneath his hands. He said nothing, but inside him a storm gathered. His tractor sat forgotten at the edge of the field, still streaked with mud, still waiting to be cleaned and repaired. But he couldn't look at it. All he could see was a strip of yellow tape cutting across his land, marking not just a barrier in the soil, but in his claim to the place itself. The crowd stayed all morning, watching the strangers work. And though no one dared cross the tape, their eyes carried the same question. What had they unearthed that required so many hands, so much secrecy, and so much speed to carry it away? By nightfall, the field no longer resembled farmland. The yellow tape still fluttered in the evening breeze, but now towering floodlights had been driven into the ground, their beams slicing to the dark like artificial daylight. Generators thrummed steadily, drowning out the usual sounds of crickets and night birds. Trucks were parked in a ring around the object, their tailgates down, equipment spread out in neat rows. The air smelled of oil, ozone, and damp earth, layered over the faint tang of metal being ready for the torch. Beyond the fence, the townsfolk had gathered again. Word had spread through the diner, down the back roads, and over every fence post in Anvil Creek. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, bundled in jackets against the chill, their breath misting as they leaned on the posts, their eyes fixed on the thing they had first uncovered with bare hands and shovels. Conversations were low, muted. No one wanted to miss what came next. Inside the cordoned-off area, men in heavy protective gear circled the object with practiced purpose. They set up rigs, checked gauges, and pulled lengths of cable across the mud. One crouched near the faint outline of the hatch that Caleb had first revealed, running his gloved hand along the seam. He nodded to the others. The decision had been made. Tonight, they would cut. Eli stood at the fence with Caleb and Jonas on either side. His hands rested on the top rail, knuckles white against the wood. He hadn't spoken much since the officials arrived, but his silence carried weight. His land, his tractor, his discovery. Yet he was a spectator now, kept at bay by strips of tape and men who refused to answer questions. Still, his eyes never left the object. The first torch flared, hissing alive in the dark. Sparks burst outward as the cutting tip pressed the steel, orange and white against the cold, black hull. A sound like tearing thunder rolled across the field as the torch traced the hatch's edge. The crowd collectively leaned forward, breath held, their faces lit by the glow. Every strike of sparks seemed to illuminate more than just the work. It lit the tension in the sheriff's jaw as he stood apart, arms crossed. It lit the unease in the faces of veterans who lingered in silence, their gazes fixed and grim. It lit the awe in the children perched on shoulders, their eyes wide at the sight of steel yielding to fire. Minutes stretched into an hour. The floodlights hummed, the torches hissed, and the air filled with the acrid smell of scorched metal. The seam grew brighter, glowing dull red as it weakened under the relentless cut. Every so often the men paused, checked their progress, and then resumed, sparks showering down like fireflies scattered in panic. Jonas leaned closer to Eli, his voice barely audible. "That's no farm relic. Look at how thick it is. Whatever's inside, they meant it to stay put." Eli gave no reply, only tightened his grip on the fence until the wood creaked under his hands. His son shifted beside him, restless, his young eyes fixed on the hatch as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. At last, with a screech that clawed at the ears, the torch cut the final inch. The men stepped back, their tools falling silent. The night seemed to rush in again, only to be broken by the clatter of steel as crowbars were wedged into the weakened seam. They heaved together, grunting, straining. The hatch groaned, resisting, then cracked with noise that rolled across the field like a rifle shot. The crowd gasped, some stepping back instinctively, others pressing closer to the fence. The hatch shifted, sparks still glowing along its edges, until it fell open with a heavy thud into the mud. A hollow darkness yawned inside, a black mouth that exhaled a faint draft of air so stale it seemed to carry the weight of decades. No one spoke, not the agents, not the sheriff, not the crowd. The silence was total, as though the whole town had frozen in that single breathless moment, waiting to see what had been sealed away beneath their soil all these years. The air that spilled from the hatch was thick and sour, the kind of breath that hadn't touched the world outside in generations. It rolled out in a low hiss, carried with it the scent of rust, oil, and something older, something that clung to the nose like dust from a forgotten cellar. The men in protective gear pulled back at first, raising their sleeves to their faces, while the townsfolk beyond the fence instinctively took a step away, as if the smell alone could reach them. Floodlights glared against the black opening, but the interior seemed to swallow the beams, revealing only a sliver at a time. Slowly, the glare caught the edges of shapes, boxes, stacked one atop the other, running the length of the chamber. The crowd leaned forward, the silence breaking into hushed murmurs. Crates, not machinery. Not bones or relics or gold glinting in the dark. Just crates, their sides rough and swollen from age, but still intact. The specialists climbed inside, their boots clanging against the steel floor. The echo was hollow, unsettling in its depth, as though the chamber stretched farther than anyone wanted to imagine. One of them brushed a glove over the top of a crate, clearing away grime until faded paint came through. A marking, stamped in block letters, though no one nearby recognized the script. It was not English, not the familiar curves of any language the veterans could name. The crowd shifted uneasily as the man leaned closer, his flashlight beam steady, tracing the strange characters. Jonas muttered under his breath, "Not at anyone in particular. That ain't Army issue. Not like anything I've seen." His words traveled to a fence line, picked up and repeated in whispers until even those at the back of the crowd knew. The crates were sealed tight, bound with metal straps that had somehow resisted the decades underground. The agents tapped at them with their tools, listening for resonance, then shook their heads. Whatever was inside, it hadn't rotted away with time. One man produced a camera, snapping photo after photo, the flash bursting against the damp steel walls. Each flash made the crowd flinch, as though lightning had struck within the chamber itself. Eli stood motionless, his cap pulled low, his eyes locked on the open hatch. His land had given up its secret, and now strangers sifted through it as if it had always belonged to them. Caleb shifted beside him, restless, his young hands gripping the fence rail until his knuckles blanched. "What do you think's in them, Pa?" he asked softly. Eli didn't answer. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The veterans at the edge of the crowd were the only ones who stayed silent. Their eyes were fixed narrow, following every movement inside the chamber. One finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "Supplies, maybe weapons. Whatever it is, it was meant to be ready if called on." The implication hung in the cool night air, dark and heavy. The agents marked each crate with chalk, numbering them one by one, as though cataloging a museum piece. The sound of their voices was muffled, but the tone carried urgency, clipped and efficient. They didn't pause to marvel or speculate. They worked with a certainty that suggested they had expected this, or at least something like it. As the floodlights burned on, the sealed interior revealed more than crates. Along the far wall, half buried in shadow, lay another marking stenciled onto the steel itself. A symbol, geometric, stark, and unfamiliar. The men inside paused at it, flashlights tracing its lines. They didn't announce what it was, not to the crowd waiting outside. They only recorded it, then turned back to their work. The field, once filled with the sound of shovels and whispered wonder, was now divided by silence and machinery. Beyond the fence, the townsfolk stood rooted, watching as if the open hatch were a stage. Inside, the crates sat in patient rows, sealed guardians of whatever truth had been buried. And though no answers had yet been given, everyone felt it in their bones. This was no relic, no accident, and no treasure hunt. This was deliberate. This was a secret never meant for them, forced into light by rain, mud, and a farmer's stubborn tractor. The night bled into morning without rest. The floodlights still burned against the pale sky as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. By then, the crates had been cataloged, chalk numbers scrawled across their sides, and the air was thick with the steady thrum of engines idling. Trucks had rolled in quietly during the dark hours, boxy, unmarked, their paint dull, their purpose clear. Men in uniform and plain clothes moved with urgency, their boots sinking into mud as they formed a line of motion, each step practiced and certain. The crowd at the fence had thinned through the night, some drawn home by exhaustion, others refusing to leave no matter how long the wait. Those who stayed now stood hollow-eyed but unyielding, their jackets pulled tight against the dawn chill, their silence louder than any protest. They had watched the cutting, the opening, the discovery of the crates, and now they watched their removal. It was not a celebration. It was not even outrage. It was a stunned quiet, as though speaking might confirm what none of them wanted to admit, that whatever had lain beneath their soil was no longer theirs to know. The agents moved with a rhythm that bordered on ritual. 2 men to a crate, sometimes for when weight demanded it, hauling them up out of the hatch and across the churned mud. Each box thudded onto the wooden pallets set beside the trucks. Forklifts whined, straining as they lifted the loads, chains rattling, gears grinding. The crates disappeared into the backs of the waiting vehicles, swallowed whole by the cavernous spaces, as if the trucks were designed for this task alone. Sheriff Dalton stood apart from the crowd, hat pulled low, arms folded tightly across his chest. His face betrayed nothing, though his presence there was telling. He had been reduced to an onlooker, just like the rest. His badge carried no weight against the men with radios and clipboards. Still, his eyes followed each crate as it left the ground, and in their narrowed intensity, one could see his unease deepen. Jonas muttered from where he leaned on the fence rail, voice low but sharp. "They're taking it all. Not a word to us. Not a single explanation. Just hauling away what's been under our feet longer than we've been alive." His words found agreement in the nods of those nearest, though no one raised their voices. No one dared. Eli stood in silence, his hand resting on the fence post, his son beside him. Caleb's jaw was tight, his young eyes burning with questions he wanted to shout. But Eli's stillness kept him quiet. The land was his, the tractor was his, but the secret had unearthed was gone now, claimed by others. He did not look at the crates. He watched the ground, scarred and broken, knowing it would never feel the same beneath his boots again. When the last crate was lifted, the hatch was sealed shut with steel plates, bolted down as though the earth itself needed silencing. The agents packed up their equipment with the same speed they had unpacked it, coiling cables, shutting down generators, dimming the floodlights one by one until the field was left in gray daylight once more. Then, without ceremony, the trucks rolled into line. Engines revved low, gears shifted, and the convoy began to move. The sound of tires grinding against gravel filled the air as the vehicles crept past the waiting townsfolk. No one waved. No one called out. They only watched, eyes tracking the unmarked convoy as it disappeared down the lane, mud dripping from the crates inside onto steel floors, leaving nothing behind but tire ruts and silence. The tape fluttered once more in the morning breeze. The field was quiet, the ground scarred, the secret taken. What remained were questions that no one would answer, questions that spread from the fence to the diner, from whispered prayers to late-night conversations. And as the last engine faded from hearing, the people of Anvil Creek stood in stunned stillness, left only with a heavy weight of wondering what had been taken from them and why it had been hidden there in the first place. The field was quiet again, but it was not the quiet Eli had known all his life. It was not the kind of silence that came after a long day's work, when the sun dipped behind the trees and the air carried the soft hum of crickets. This was heavier, unnatural, a hush that clung to the ground like fog and refused to lift. The trucks were gone, the tape torn down, the floodlights dismantled. Yet the land still bore the wounds of their presence. Deep ruts from tires, churned mud hardened by the sun, and in the center, a scarred patch where the hatch had been sealed shut, metal plates sunk into the earth as if to muzzle whatever lay below. Eli stood near his tractor, the machine still caked in dried mud, its paint streaked and its tires scored from the struggle. Once, he would have gone straight to work cleaning it, tending to it as carefully as a man tends to an old friend. But now it stood forgotten, little more than a bystander to the secret it had accidentally unearthed. His hands rested on his hips, his cap low against the morning light, his eyes fixed not on the machine, but on the scar at the center of his land. The soil looked sickly, darker than it should, and where the men had dug, nothing grew. Even the smell was raw and metallic bitter, carrying the faint tang of fuel and something chemical. He drew in a slow breath, then let it out, the weight of it settling in his chest. This was no longer the field he had known, no longer the ground he had trusted beneath his boots. It had been changed, altered by what it had given up and what had been taken. The neighbors didn't come that morning. The crowd was gone, the fence line empty. After days of watching, waiting, and whispering, the town had slipped back into itself, though not unchanged. At the diner they would still talk, voices lowered, wondering what had been sealed away, why it had been buried there, and why it had been taken so quickly. The rumors would grow, spreading into stories too large for truth to hold them. But out here in the field itself, there was no noise left, only silence. Caleb had asked questions when the trucks rolled away, his voice sharp with frustration. Eli had answered none of them. Some things, he thought, were too heavy to put into words. Jonas had stood with him for a time, leaning on the fence, muttering about government men and secrets that never should have been dug up. But eventually he too had gone, leaving Eli alone with the land, alone with the silence. He walked a slow circuit around the scar, his boots crunching against hardened mud, each step measured. He felt like an intruder on his own soil. Every furrow, every patch of grass seemed changed by what had been revealed, as though the ground itself remembered. His shadow stretched long across the field, falling into mark where the hatch had been, and he shivered despite the morning sun. The tractor loomed behind him, but he did not turn back to it. Work could wait. Harvest could wait. The land had spoken in its own way, and now it had closed its mouth again, leaving only questions. Eli tilted his head, listening, but there was nothing to hear. No birds, no breeze, not even the rustle of leaves. Just silence, thick and absolute. He removed his cap and held it at his side, his hair damp with sweat. For a long while he simply stood there, eyes on the scar, breathing in the poisoned air. The trucks had carried the mystery away, but the weight of it remained, pressed into the soil and into his bones. Whatever had been hidden was gone now, swallowed by silence and guarded by secrecy. But Eli knew the field would never be the same, and neither would he. Some discoveries were not meant for those who found them. Some truths belonged only to the earth. And so he stood, a farmer without answers, on land that no longer felt like his own.